Why was his stomach feeling so irritated? Why were his eyes getting blurry? And why was the already tight hollow of the tree seeming like it was getting tighter? Just then, from outside, he could hear those noises again, that of the leaves and their sing-songy voice. Climb up, Sam." The squirrels had changed from their gentle demeanor to something quite different, and their once yellow eyes were turning color, fading into a sort of burnt orange and then finally into a fiery red. This was indeed alarming. My feet are hot." Sam looked down to find that where there should have been the bottom of the tree was nothing short of a flaming red pit of fire. "Dear Sam, climb up." The song rose from all sides of the tree. Climb what? There would be no stuttering this time. His feet were scrambling to find a hold, which was a lot harder inside the tree. Therefore, his emotions were raised well past the peak that usually forced the words out clearly and loudly. Sam looked around for a grip on anything, at the same time battling the squirrels that were now biting and scratching him. He felt the walls of the hollow, scraping and pinching frantically, and finally found with his fingers a kind of ladder, so he began to climb. And he kept climbing for what felt like miles. He found it odd that the ladder didn't bend or move in branch-like directions, nor did his space get any smaller. It wasn't a luxurious amount of space for sure, but it was weird that it stayed the same. He also felt cooler by degrees, and the squirrels suddenly gave up trying to grab at his feet, as if the direction he was heading itself frightened them. Sam didn't know which. He could feel the night air increasingly unabated upon his skin as he climbed. It filled his lungs, and the exhales took his fear with it. A sudden burst of starlight revealed an entirely different scene. There he was, way over the earth, sitting on what seemed like a bench in the clouds. Sam stood there for a moment in utter awe. All his fears and his tiredness, angst and insecurity spread out from him and dispersed over the landscape that was in front of him. He could see the hedge from here. It went on and on as far as he could see. He saw what he thought was the river, though the only light to see it with was what was gifted by the bright and lusty moon. He almost forgot that the previous night had passed once again without sleep, and this one was bent on the same result. Perhaps this was a perfect place to lay down and rest, but all he could do was stare into the darkness with an emboldened soul. His emboldened soul eventually caved into something akin to horror as he realized that the hedge stretching for miles and miles into the darkened horizon meant he was stuck right where he was for the unforeseen future. He sat down with deepest discouragement, such a stark contrast to what had filled his heart just moments before. Then out from the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move. Sam crouched down as far as he could and tried to get a glimpse of what or who was moving around him, but there was no place to hide way up there in the tree. Who's there?" he said in a hushed tone. If it was who he thought it was, this would be the end, he felt sure. There was just no place to go but down the tree, so he swung on one of the branches most available to him. This was risky business for most people, but he was adept at climbing trees, so down he went, one branch at a time, not missing a single grip, like he was using the climbing wall at school, a place he was overly familiar with due to his lack of friends. As he climbed down, he felt the same eerie shadow move around him, giving him chills right up his spine. He tried not to look, for fear he might be blinded on the spot. At last he reached the ground, but now where to? Sam started to run in any direction available. At least he wasn't drowsy this time, but he could feel the dark shadow close behind him, following him whatever turn he made in the dark. "Oh, please, please, please," he thought, "help me." There was a strange light shining in front of him from the moment he whispered that weak prayer, and then suddenly there were the little leaves all around, humming and whispering like the times before. "Oh, hello," Sam exclaimed, panting as he ran. "Peace," they began to sing. "Follow the light." "Where?" They repeated themselves. "Peace, Sam. Follow the light." "Where is the light?" Singing of the leaves got louder and louder, which only flustered Sam. He felt like he was running in circles to begin with, but the constant high-pitched crescendos in his ear made him want to bat the air around him with his fists. Stop! He was startlingly on the verge of succumbing to whatever was behind him at any minute. "I cannot see the light anymore." Then Sam fell on his face, the quick result of tripping over a protruding stone. "Oh, no," sang the leaves in four-part harmony. Between his groans, Sam rang out a depleted "help" again. Then suddenly there were familiar claws around his arms and legs. You again!" "Get up, Sam." It was Battle. "Let's go." Sentience had his other arm. "Come on, Sam." Battle gave it such a powerful kick that the whole ground shook. Sam was sure that it had startled whatever was behind him. Boy, was he grateful to see these two again. Before he knew it was already underground in a brand new burrow, or at least it was different than the one he had remembered. For a moment, Sam sat there in their main room, a little embarrassed with himself, while Sentience and Battle made no attempt, per usual, at discourse. Then he queried eagerly, new place? The rabbits looked at each other and appeared to be slightly annoyed. You're no farther than you were before. This might have been a question if there was the slightest inflection, but judging by their disappointed expression, this was definitely stated as a resolute fact. The inference brought back all the reasons he had tried to escape their presence before in utter dismay. Sam could tell this would escalate to volcano-esque degree if he didn't shut his mouth for the time being. But who knew how long that would last? He only narrowed his eyes and pierced his lips without one thing to say. While Sam sat there in the tiny new rabbit kitchen stewing, he thought of all the dead ends he had experienced in the short time he had been in this new world. What was wrong with all this beside the obvious? Why was every effort made to return home thwarted? Why was there a blinder out trying to get him? What was he missing? And why were his choices so few? Most of all, why was his only hope two rabbits who were no real help at all? Do you want something to eat? Battle interrupted Sam's thoughts. Sam was starving, but still resistant. What is it? He could smell something rather pleasant coming from the stovetop. Vegetable stew. Battle rolling his eyes as if Sam should have known. He turned to Sentience, nevertheless, to what seemed like a quest to confirm his notion. That's right, Sentience yelled from the kitchen without turning around. Sam shrugged. Is that a yes or a no? Battle asked this like a perturbed mother of a teenager. Fine, Sam said, trying his hardest not to look too excited about quieting the hunger cries coming from his stomach. What happened next took him completely by surprise as the two rabbits solemnly gathered by their little table and bowed their heads in utter surrender to what they quietly referred to as the source, praising the greatness of its provisions and care and thanking it with heavy-laden pauses and awe-filled reflections. Sam approached quietly, stupefied by this display of faith, and sat quietly at the only empty seat. He was not at all concerned that his meal was getting cold, nor was he offended by what was taking place. He wanted to see what they obviously saw with their eyes of faith. After the rabbits had finished their prayer, they immediately started munching, as rabbits do, as if their stewed vegetables would fly out of their bowls. But Sam forgot all about his hunger, even though the fantastic scent was wafting about the room in a blanket of homey warmth. What was that? Were the only words he could form a question with. Sentience gave him a sideways glance and allowed space for a long, uncomfortable pause. Prayer. Sam couldn't understand it. Why had he just experienced such openness and communion, only to return to this familiar but uncomfortable distance between himself and these two furry gatekeepers, or so they seemed? Sam slumped down into his chair and began to eat the delicious stew. Battle seemed to be reading his thoughts and added one of his own. We're on your side, Sam. Sentience, without looking up, added his own remark. Should be obvious by now. I know, Sam started recalling with a wave of emotion the 2 times he had been saved by these two, but returned to a calmer position, adding, I just feel like I'm not good enough for you two. Sam looked at both Sentience and Battle up and down to communicate without words what he was sure was the source of his insecurities. That's not something you picked up from us. Battle looked at Sentience, and Sentience returned his gaze. Sam was not convinced of this at all. Feelings aside, Sentience patted him on the back. No one is good enough without the source. Really? Sam looked up, half with still a perturbed feeling and half with welcome surprise. Never once had Sam made the connection that the reason these two seemed to have it together was the source, and not some predisposition, something innate about them. Nope, Battle confirmed. Pressure's off. The spoons continued clicking against the sides of the bowls while Sam pondered this statement. So, if I find the source, I make it home? Sam queried with renewed excitement. You'll be changed. Battle set a spoon down in his bowl to mark his statement with a last click. Why didn't you say so? Sam almost screamed. Sentience blinked for the sake of his large ears gathering all that noise. You weren't open to it, definitively stated. Oh, man! Sam started gathering the nothing that he brought, but looked around anyway. All I have to do is find the source and I'll get out of here. The excitement consumed him and he found his escape route through the too tiny for these large rabbits' burrow, but paused mostly tuned to the eerie feeling that this had all taken place before. He was left without the momentum to actually leave. He turned to find Sentience and Battle sitting silently with their large eyes blinking at intervals. What now? Sam stood motionless, uneasiness covering him like a hot blanket. Battle feigned surprise. This is difficult for rabbits. You're asking us? With an admission that was altogether painful for Sam, he replied, Yes. What should I do? Sentience could not help but add his own sarcasm to the discussion. Well, running out of the room without any direction probably won't get you where you want to go. We've been there before. Battle nodded his large ear-infested head. By we, I mean you. I know, Sam sheepishly admitted, sitting on his chair again in an exasperated heap. But you two are so aggravatingly slow and confusing. A reprised fiend look of surprise emerged from Battle. It must have been a hard day for him. Us? Difficult? You, Sentience continued to add his 2 bits as if it was adding ingredients to his pot of soup. You're the difficult one. With this, both rabbits began laughing heartily, but without the involvement of the third party. He was putting his tired head in his hands with a long, annoyed sigh, but there was a smile there, far below the surface. Sam wasn't sure he trusted these two yet, as he sat up and reached for another bowl of soup, but he was learning that they weren't against him, which for him was like a broken piece of his young, war-torn heart finding its way back into its proper position. He finally resolved to just sit there, perhaps a little ill at ease, and maybe still a little confused, alongside the chattering and laughing. Battle and Sentience, the 2 large and annoying rabbits. When Sam could not take it any longer, for the suspense was killing him, he abruptly asked, So, what do I do? Battle, this time without blinking at all, responded, Get some sleep. Sentience followed, Rest, tired one, you have much reflecting to do. Was that a hint of warmth Sam was picking up on? It was so hard to tell with rabbits. What? The last thing Sam wanted to do was sit around and think. Reflect about what? When Sam made time to think, it was a flood of horrors. There were very few filters that he had at his disposal. They had all been demolished, one unexplained traumatic experience at a time. Battle seemed to understand Sam's deep apprehension and reiterated his directions. Just sleep, Sam. The large rabbits hopped around their little den and threw some blankets into a pile for Sam to use as a bed. At least that is what he supposed it was. Rabbits did not know how to make beds at all. Would you like some straw? Sentience queried. No, I wouldn't. Sam grimaced for a moment, staring at the pile of mismatched towels, blankets, and cloths, and wondered if Sentience and Battle had ever heard of a pillow. Suit yourself. Sentience responded with an air of doubt, and Sam was not sure how it was done with the rabbit's non-existent shoulders, but thought he saw a shrug of some sort. I'll be fine. Sam reconciled himself to this position for the moment, the overall circumstances as they were, knowing full well he would have to fight his reoccurring urge to escape in the morning. Why must he stay and learn from these two? This was still the pervading question. He collapsed in defeat on the pile of lumpy fabric and watched Sentience and Battle hop away to their respective rooms. He lay there on the floor for a long while, staring up at the dirt ceiling. The fire in the stove was burning brightly, casting all sorts of eerie images everywhere. A strange fear began to well up inside him. It was the kind of fear that amused itself by asking too many questions. Strange, deranged ones like, why will I wake up? What if these 2 rabbits are really just kidnappers and I'll never see Mom again? What if finding the source is a bad idea? What if it swallows me whole like a black hole? What if this is all just a crazy long dream? Or what if I'm delusional and Mom puts me in a loony bin? So it was with Sam and so many like him whose short lives, having been filled with extreme trauma, were now marked by this harrowing secret enemy they carried around with them. If it were somehow tangible, if it were explainable, if it were a person, it would be the darkest villain in any comic series, able to do utmost destruction to whole city blocks, but it was his soul that lay victim. A perfect friend that kept him safe if he felt he should escape, only revealing itself to be the perfect enemy, exacting unrest to his mind and heart and pulling him away from all forward momentum. So young, yet so old. Sam turned onto his side, only to realize that Battle was lying at the archway of his room. Although it was dark, Sam could tell that it was him. He had his eyes wide open as if watching over the room, perched on his feet like a nesting bird. He doesn't have any blankets at all, Sam thought. He wondered now, after complaining about it, if the rabbits had given him all of their bedding, and since it was getting colder, the more the fire dissipated, he thought he would offer up at least a few of the rags that he was laying on top of. Battle! Sam spat out a shouting sort of whisper to arouse Battle from what he thought was his surveillance position. Battle jolted from his position, all right, and was now standing on all fours. What? Sam, what's the trouble? I just... Sam stopped himself, realizing what had just happened. Were you asleep? Yes, I was. Battle seemed a bit annoyed with the lack of emergency waking him up. Rabbits can sleep with their eyes open or shut. Oh, Sam was embarrassed. I'm sorry. Do you want a blanket? No, thank you all the same. Battle settled back down to his previous pose. We don't know much about what you humans call comfort. That explains a lot, Sam thought to himself as he shifted himself from one uncomfortable position to another. This is going to be a long night. Somewhere in the silence, after both rabbit and human extracted themselves from conversation, Sam fell into a dreamy state. He could feel himself being pulled as if he was in some kind of fight, like taking a look at the inner workings of his own heart. He saw shadows and light, but no distinct figures. He also felt encompassed with terror, as though he should be trying to get away from real, eternal danger. So he found himself running, only to end up locked inside a dark, ominous basement or a dead end belonging to a vast maze. The only physical distinction he could really make out were the unmistakable demonic claws around his hands and feet, pulling him off into who knew where. He was so terrorized and pulled so hard that he thought he might lose an arm or a foot in the endeavor. Whatever belonged to the claws was not giving up. Then there was a strange light, and inside the light was peace. Unexplainable peace. But how could he stay in the light? Where were the answers? When Sam woke up, dripping with sweat, it seemed well past sunrise, but since there were no clocks, he was unsure. The clear indication that he had overslept was the two fur-laden individuals sitting at the table sipping something hot out of undersized cups. Both were staring at him, adding the familiar blinking, but only at intervals. What time is it? Sam rubbed his eyes, sort of disappointed he was still in the same company. Time? Battle and Sentience turned to each other and commenced their silent, low-firing blinking attacks. The only time we keep account of here is the time ill-used. Battle took a drink of his beverage, but it was apparently still too hot, and his whiskers sprung out from his face like the TV antenna Sam's grandmother had on top of her house. Sam chortled, and Sentience followed, while Battle helplessly tried to change topic to the subject of pancakes, and whether or not Sam wanted any. But by this time, both Sentience and Sam were unstoppable in their amusement. Very funny, Battle lowered his gaze in defeat, the fur lining his eyes like one large eyebrow. And when the laughing dropped off to at least a decibel that could be spoken over, he asked if they were finished yet. Pancakes did sound appealing to Sam, but he had some doubts about the ingredients belonging to pancakes such as these. What kind are they? He thought he saw Battle's eyes gleam for a moment, as if there was something else he wanted to add besides the pending response. Multigrain, of course, Battle announced. He seemed very proud of his pancake-making capabilities. And actually, it's one pancake. Sam must have looked confused because he continued, I know you're probably used to individual pancakes, but here we bake one, in the oven. Sam knew for sure this had a heavier meaning. The pregnant pause indicated as such, but Sam was too hungry and his brain needed sustenance to work that out at a later time.